Ephesians 5:1-4 says, "Therefore be imitators of God, beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself for us, for an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. But immorality or any other impurity or greed must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints. And there must be no filthiness or silly talk or coarse jesting, which is not fitting, but rather the giving of thanks." Well, if you're joining us in reading through the 60-day reading plan, today's reading is Ephesians 4:17 through 5:21, and I encourage you to read that passage. And what exactly does it mean to be an imitator? If you imitate some action, how would you first approach the process? What would the ultimate product look like? Could someone tell the difference between you and the one whom you're imitating? Now, when I was growing up, it was very popular for people to imitate voices and actions of famous people. Vice President Nixon, President Kennedy, and President Johnson were all imitated, and millions of records were sold with these fake voices. I even tried to mimic some of the people myself. I became very proficient in mimicking President Kennedy's voice and his brother Bobby, but I could never get Nixon or President Johnson. Now, when we imitate somebody, we have to work at learning their person's physical actions, their voice inflection, and their sound. And in some way, we have to begin to think like that person, because in our thinking, we'll begin to act that way. This is exactly what Paul wants us to do in chapter 5. He wants us to be imitators of God by imitating Christ. We're to be God's children, and now that means that examples, like when our older daughter was in elementary school, I had a very interesting experience. I had to go to the school for some reason, and when I walked into the office, the secretary immediately said, "Oh, you must be Raya's," our oldest daughter, "dad." I did not have to say a word, and she recognized that my daughter and I had similar actions, and we looked very similar. Now, if you're walking down the street, do people look at you and see Christ? Are you shopping? As you're shopping, do people see Christ in you? When you're in your home, does your spouse or your children see Christ? These are very difficult questions, because the chances are we fail miserably in our imitation of Christ. Now, Thomas à Kempis, who was a 15th century priest in Germany and Holland, wrote a book entitled The Imitation of Christ. This is a book which should be read by all Christians. You may disagree with some parts of it because it comes from a Catholic background, but you cannot disagree with what he's writing about and encouraging us to be. Throughout church history, men and women of Christ have been encouraged to respond differently through repentance and focusing on Christ. The only way that we can change is by looking up and maintaining a focus on Christ.